At 20,000 feet over occupied Europe, a B-17 flying fortress is riddled with flak and cannon fire as smoke fills the fuselage, oxygen lines are severed, and signal flares ignite, feeding a rapidly spreading fire that threatens the aircraft and everyone aboard. The crew braces to bail out, but one man, Staff Sergeant Maynard H. Smith, refuses to leave. With flames licking his hands and molten metal burning his skin, he crawls into the inferno, fighting the blaze with nothing but his bare hands, knowing every second counts, because if he fails, there will be no bomber left to save. On the morning of May 1, 1943, the B-17F Rough Road lifted off from Polebrook, England, as part of the 91st Bomb Group bound for Saint-Nazaire in occupied France, targeting a heavily fortified U-boat base protected by massive concrete pens and dense anti-aircraft fire, with crews fully aware that casualty rates were high and few aircraft returned unscathed. Among the 10 men aboard was Staff Sergeant Maynard H. Smith, a 25-year-old enlisted waist gunner and radio operator whose role seemed ordinary until flak bursts began rocking the aircraft, a shell ripping through the fuselage near the radio compartment, rupturing oxygen lines and igniting magnesium signal flares, filling the bomber with thick smoke as oxygen-fed flames spread rapidly. Loose ammunition threatened detonation, the aircraft lurched violently, and the pilot ordered preparations to bail out while crewmen clipped on parachutes and moved toward the bomb bay, yet Smith did not move to escape, instead assessing that the fire was advancing toward the ammunition racks and would destroy the aircraft, crawling into the smoke with a small extinguisher and asbestos gloves that failed almost instantly, forcing him to make a conscious decision to continue with his bare hands, removing burning flares and debris and throwing them out open hatches as his gloves burned through, his palms blistered, molten metal scorched his fingers, and when an ammunition box ignited he beat out the flames with his boots and hands. Collapsing from smoke inhalation and dragging himself to an open hatch for air before returning to the fire, enduring more than half an hour of flames while German fighters attacked the crippled bomber that had fallen behind the formation, the crew remaining aboard with survival dependent entirely on Smith's actions until the fire finally died, Smith collapsing again with severe burns as the bomber limped back toward England and crash-landed at an emergency field with no crewmen killed by the fire, after which Smith was hospitalized with second- and third-degree burns, undergoing weeks of uncertain rehabilitation, and in December 1943 receiving the Medal of Honor, the first awarded to an enlisted airman in the 8th Air Force, the citation stating only the facts of decisive action inside a burning aircraft at altitude, an ordeal that reflected the brutal reality of the air war over Europe and the thin line between survival and death faced daily by B-17 crews. By the time Maynard Smith was recovering in an English hospital, the air war over Europe was escalating into one of the most lethal phases of the Second World War, and in the spring of 1943 the 8th Air Force continued its doctrine of daylight precision bombing, believing tightly formed bomber streams bristling with .50 caliber machine guns could defend themselves without continuous fighter escort, a belief experience was already proving false, the Saint-Nazaire mission that nearly destroyed Rough Road was part of a wider campaign against Germany's submarine infrastructure, as U-boats ravaged Allied shipping and deep strikes against heavily defended coastal bases were deemed essential despite predictable losses, especially beyond fighter range, while inside the B-17 fire remained the most immediate and deadly threat, fed by ruptured oxygen lines and onboard equipment like signal flares, spreading faster than crews could counter as smoke filled lungs and forced men to crawl blind. Through narrow fuselages, Smith's actions were extraordinary, but the danger he faced was shared across the 8th Air Force, with 1943 damage reports documenting numerous mid-air fires ending in explosions, the difference in his case being timing, decisiveness, and endurance, prompting the 8th Air Force to study such incidents, intensify fire drills, re-evaluate storage of flares and ammunition, and emphasize immediate action, marginally improving survival odds as German fighters shifted to head-on attacks, flak belts thickened, and isolated bombers were routinely destroyed, fires remaining a leading cause. Smith's burns kept him from combat, his hands never fully recovering, and he was sent on war bond tours, his story representing the often unseen heroism of enlisted airmen, while the broader lesson of Rough Road revealed that the air war was not just strategy and tonnage but a chain of personal crises at extreme altitude where survival hinged on split-second decisions, lessons absorbed into crew culture even before long-range escorts like the P-51 reduced losses, yet the psychological scars of fire, flak, and sudden damage endured, shaping the 8th Air Force more deeply than statistics. making Smith's actions symbolic of a brutal reality in which courage mattered, but survival depended equally on luck, and where a single second of hesitation could mean death.
Continuing from the harrowing events aboard Rough Road, the air war in 1943 became a relentless test of endurance for both men and machines as missions deep into Germany exposed bomber crews to increasingly sophisticated defenses, with cities like Bremen, Wilhelmshaven, and Regensburg surrounded by dense flak belts coordinated by radar-directed fire, while German fighters refined tactics to hunt stragglers and already damaged aircraft. For those who survived initial attacks, internal emergencies were often just as deadly, as fires caused by ruptured oxygen lines, ignited flares, or cooking ammunition spread rapidly through confined fuselages, blinding crews with smoke, searing exposed skin, and forcing split-second decisions where hesitation meant destruction, making Smith's actions aboard Rough Road an unofficial benchmark within the 91st Bomb Group as crews studied the rapid spread of fire, the dangers of unsecured flares, and the necessity of immediate action, lessons that shaped intensified fire drills, coordinated rescue practices inside smoke-filled compartments, and incremental aircraft design changes such as relocating flares, reinforcing oxygen lines, and adjusting ammunition placement, all aimed not at eliminating risk but at slightly widening the margin between survival and death. Despite these measures, chance still ruled, with damage reports from mid-1943 documenting numerous bombers lost to fires identical to the one Smith extinguished, survival often hinging on mere seconds, while Smith himself bore permanent scars on his hands, returned only to limited duty, and saw his story remain largely personal despite the Medal of Honor, reflecting how the true reality of the air war was defined not by publicized victories but by unseen struggles inside damaged aircraft, as the broader bombing campaign continued into late 1943 with heavy losses, limited escort protection, and near-certain destruction for isolated bombers, leading veterans to later recall that the real test of an airman was not marksmanship but the ability to control fear and act decisively amid fire and smoke, lessons passed informally to new crews and reinforced by commanders, and even as long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang began shifting the balance in 1944, internal dangers remained constant, underscoring that in B-17 the ultimate determinant of survival was the human factor, where courage, judgment, and physical endurance in moments of crisis could mean the difference between life and death, and where Smith's endurance remained a rare exception rather than the rule. As the war pressed into 1944, bomber crews faced the culmination of everything they had learned and everything they had feared over the previous 2 years as the 8th Air Force grew larger, better equipped, and increasingly confident, yet the realities of combat remained unchanged, with fire, flak, and structural damage constant threats and every mission carrying the possibility of disaster within the aircraft itself. For those flying deep into Germany, altitude, thin air, and freezing temperatures amplified every hazard, as a fire manageable at lower levels could spiral out of control at 20,000 feet where oxygen-fed flames spread faster, smoke became more suffocating, and even minor injuries turned debilitating without immediate medical aid. Veterans who survived internal fires later described them as the most terrifying experiences of their service, because enemy fighters could be tracked and flak predicted, while fires inside the fuselage offered little warning beyond the smell of smoke or a faint flicker of flame before visibility vanished, and even seasoned crewmen struggled through narrow aisles amid heat, smoke, and the threat of ammunition detonation, making every second critical. Incidents like the one aboard Rough Road became informal benchmarks for training as crews shared practical, undramatized accounts of how Smith repeatedly entered the fire even after his gloves burned through and how his actions prevented flames from reaching ammunition that would have destroyed the bomber entirely, reinforcing that survival was the only measure of success. Aircraft design continued to evolve in response, with extinguishers repositioned, flare storage revised, oxygen lines reinforced, materials tested for heat resistance, and fire procedures systematized, yet the human factor remained decisive because technology could only delay disaster while men determined whether a bomber returned. Meanwhile, the strategic bombing campaign pushed deeper into Germany against heavily defended industrial centers, ball-bearing factories, and transport hubs, as crews flew repeated sorties with little recovery time in worn aircraft where fires, structural failures, and smoke-filled cabins became predictable dangers. For enlisted airmen the risks were especially acute, as gunners, radio operators, and engineers often made life-or-death decisions during emergencies despite receiving less recognition, making Smith's Medal of Honor emblematic of how courage, endurance, and quick judgment could decide a mission's fate. The psychological toll was immense, with crews living under the constant knowledge that a single flak burst could ignite a fatal fire, yet experience taught them that panic killed faster than flames and control of fear was as vital as technical skill. By late 1944, even as long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang reduced losses from isolation, internal hazards remained unchanged, leaving fires, smoke, and structural damage as ever-present reminders that every flight was a calculated risk. Smith's actions aboard Rough Road continued to resonate quietly among airmen not because they were widely publicized, but because they embodied the precise courage demanded by the air war, proving that survival depended on decisive action in moments where seconds mattered, and revealing the dual nature of aerial combat as massive formations pursued strategic objectives above while human endurance confronted immediate crisis within the smoke-filled corridors of a B-17. Continuing from the crucible of repeated missions, bomber crews in 1944 understood that survival depended on far more than formation discipline or fighter escort. Each aircraft carried not only bombs but also the potential for catastrophe within its own fuselage, as fires, ruptured fuel lines, and shattered oxygen systems remained ever-present threats, and even minor damage could escalate with terrifying speed. For men like Maynard Smith, the difference between survival and disaster was measured in seconds and inches, and crews who had witnessed incidents like Rough Road knew that technical skill alone was insufficient. Quick thinking, decisive action, and physical endurance often determined whether a bomber returned intact or became another casualty statistic, a reality reinforced daily on missions that penetrated deep into Germany's industrial heart. By mid-1944, Allied air campaigns had intensified, striking synthetic oil plants, ball-bearing factories, and rail networks, all heavily defended with overlapping flak belts and concentrated fighter coverage. Pilots, navigators, and gunners endured relentless attacks, yet internal emergencies within the aircraft were often deadlier than external threats, as fires ignited by flak, electrical faults, or accidental ignition of flares could rapidly engulf the fuselage, giving crews only seconds to respond and leaving no room for hesitation. The lessons of Smith's ordeal became quietly embedded in aircrew culture. Fire drills grew more detailed, emphasizing rapid identification, immediate response, and coordinated action. Gunners, engineers, and radio operators were trained to think beyond their assigned stations. Waist gunners helped move wounded crewmates, radio operators assisted with fire suppression, and survival depended on collective effort, improvisation, and courage under extreme conditions. Aircraft modifications reflected these experiences. Flares and oxygen lines were relocated to reduce fire risk, wiring insulation was improved, and compartment layouts were adjusted for better accessibility. These changes did not eliminate danger, but they provided crews slightly more time to respond, a margin that, in Smith's case, had been decisive. Even with these technological and tactical improvements, the psychological impact of fire remained profound. Veterans recalled the heat of flames, the choking smoke, and the sound of burning metal, experiences that left lasting impressions and shaped actions on subsequent missions. Survival became as much a mental discipline as a physical one. Smith's Medal of Honor, while honoring his extraordinary actions, also highlighted the broader reality of the air war. Enlisted crewmen often faced the most immediate life or death choices, and decisions made in moments of crisis could determine not only the fate of an aircraft but that of the entire formation. These decisions, rarely recorded in official reports, shaped the course of the campaign in subtle but critical ways. As the war entered its final months, fighter escorts, improved tactics, and accumulated experience slightly reduced bomber losses. Nevertheless, internal hazards, fires, mechanical failures, and structural weaknesses continued to claim aircraft and crews, a constant reminder that even in a victorious offensive, the margin for error at 20,000 feet was perilously thin. For Smith, the physical scars of that day remained a lifelong testament to the extreme dangers faced by bomber crews. His story, while exceptional in outcome, reflected a broader truth. Survival often depended on individual action under pressure, on courage exercised in confined spaces, and on the rare alignment of skill, timing, and circumstance. In the grand narrative of the air war, where statistics and targets dominate, Smith's ordeal underscores the human reality behind the machines. Amid formations of steel and engines, it was the men inside who ultimately determined life or death. The war in Europe was nearing its end by early 1945, but for aircrews like those aboard Rough Road, the dangers and memories of flight remained ever present. Survival had never been guaranteed, and repeated missions had left deep physical and psychological scars. Fires inside the aircraft, though less frequent than flak attacks, continued to pose a silent and lethal threat, even as Allied air superiority increased and Luftwaffe resistance dwindled. Veterans later emphasized the enduring lessons of these onboard fires. Speed, decisiveness, and calm under pressure could mean the difference between life and death. Smith's actions aboard Rough Road provided a practical model for extreme emergency response in the air. Though every incident was unique, the principles were consistent: identify the source of danger, act immediately, protect crew and aircraft, and persevere until the threat was neutralized. Even with long-range escorts and incremental improvements in aircraft design, internal emergencies could never be completely mitigated. Smoke, heat, and structural damage demanded not only skill but extraordinary physical endurance. Narrow aisles, exposed equipment, and limited firefighting tools meant crew reaction times were measured in seconds. One hesitation or misjudgment could lead to disaster almost instantly. Within the 8th Air Force, Smith's experience became part of an unofficial body of knowledge that shaped training, procedures, and crew assignments. It highlighted the importance of redundancy, preparation, and improvisation in combat. Airmen studying past incidents understood that the effectiveness of planes and tactics depended entirely on the people operating them under extreme stress. Post-war analyses, including the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, primarily focused on industrial targets, bomb tonnage, and strategic outcomes. Yet these reports also acknowledged case studies of internal aircraft emergencies, revealing insights into human factors, crew coordination, and survival strategies. Smith's ordeal was repeatedly cited as an example of how individual initiative could prevent catastrophe, even when the odds of survival seemed minimal. Maynard Smith returned to civilian life quietly, carrying the physical and emotional marks of his service. His hands bore permanent scars from burns, and the memory of crawling through smoke and flames remained with him. Unlike fighter aces or widely publicized missions, his story was largely preserved in military records and the recollections of fellow crewmen. Yet it endures as a vivid testament to the human realities of high-altitude air combat. The legacy of Rough Road extends beyond Smith's heroism. It illustrates a crucial truth of the air war: survival was not dictated solely by aircraft performance, formation tactics, or mission planning. It depended on instantaneous decision-making, physical endurance, and the ability to act decisively under extreme conditions. Historians and veterans alike emphasize the extraordinary challenges faced by bomber crews. Fires, mechanical failures, and enemy action created an environment where every second was critical. Within the confined fuselage of a B-17, courage was measured not in aerial victories but in the ability to preserve life and keep the aircraft aloft despite imminent danger. Maynard Smith's story remains a quiet, sobering example of the human dimension of aerial warfare. It reminds us that behind every strategic calculation and headline statistic were men confronting immediate, mortal peril. At 20,000 feet, with fire consuming the fuselage, survival depended on action, endurance, and sheer will, and, in rare cases, on the courage and determination of a single individual.